This is the second half of today's Campbell Lecture, and we're very lucky to have Suw Charman Anderson as our guest speaker today. I don't know those of you who've perhaps heard of Suw already. When we have the annual Campbell Lecture, it's a really exciting time because we can all go, oh yeah, I'd really like to hear from so-and-so. And it's interesting. I mean, Suw comes to us with a background as a geologist, so 2 geologists today is something. There's recruitment for the geology department, isn't there? Like Jane, she's had an interesting and varied career, but she's chosen a very different pathway. And I think that's really interesting for us who are sitting in the audience today, because there's no one single route, and there's no one perfect profile. And understanding that and understanding how you can move and make changes according to your particular expertise and how you can learn about yourself and develop yourself are really valuable things which WSIT promotes at Southampton and more broadly the university promotes. Suw, you may have heard of her via Ada Lovelace Day. Anybody heard about Ada Lovelace Day? And Suw's commitment to sort of grassroots social campaigning was one of the things that led to that. Indeed, also in her participation in an earlier activity with the Open Rights Society, campaigning for better governance in the area of personal data. So very important things. I'm not going to say any more. I think Suw's got a very interesting speech lined up for us. I hope that it will be valuable to you, and it gives me the greatest of pleasure to introduce her right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. As you heard from Suw, I'm a bit of an activist, also a social technologist, and I'm going to talk to you about the invention of career and the ways in which we invent our careers, both in terms of the stories that we tell about our careers and the things that we do to create the jobs that we have. And I think that any story of career begins with the word itself. When you hear the word career, you usually think of its meaning as a noun, an occupation undertaken for a significant period of a person's life and with opportunities for progress. But it does have another meaning, one that's a little less often used. As a verb, to career means to move swiftly and in an uncontrolled way. And when I think of my career, I have to say that it is much more verb than noun. In fact, I tried to sit down and map my career out, and it got a little bit messy. As you can see, I started, as Jane did, with a degree in geology, and in fact, I do still think of myself as a lapsed geologist. But I then went on to science publishing, and that was in part because when I graduated, there'd been a hiring freeze on, so the activity of core logging, which was an almost standard progression for a geologist, was not really available. And so I moved to London and ended up working on 3 biology journals for a couple of years. And then I made the obvious and I think, clear decision that the next thing to do would be to go into admin in a popular music school, working with mostly young men, sort of late teens, early 20s, to help them navigate the idea of actually learning how to be in a band. And that was interesting. Whilst I was at that school, the owner asked me to get him some coverage in The Melody Maker, which was at that time a weekly music newspaper. It was very famous. And I completely failed to achieve that because The Melody Maker weren't actually all that interested in this music school. However, I got to know one of the editors there very well and managed to convince him to let me write for them as a freelance music journalist. My first ever commission was to go to a Blur gig, interview their crew and write up this piece about their guitars, their amps, their gear. And that was awesome for me because I was just like the biggest Blur fan on the planet. So to be basically told that for a living you had to go to a gig, and I got to stand on the side of stage and watch the gig from the side, it was fantastic. And so I decided that was going to be what I was going to do. I was going to be a music journalist. It was going to be fantastic. I lasted about 2 years because it actually turns out to be hyper competitive, because there are a lot of people out there who want to be music journalists and who are quite willing to work for free. I found it incredibly difficult. I was, oddly enough, I'm not actually very outgoing. I was not very confident. I found it very difficult to get work. And I got to the point where after a couple of years, I decided I quite liked this whole eating thing and sort of sleeping in a bed thing, and decided then to take another, I think, very logical choice, to move into technology and become a web designer. Now, in the late 90s, if you knew HTML, you could be a web designer. So that's what I did. I taught myself HTML, no real design skills, but that was kind of okay because no one else at that time had any design skills either. And that was starting to look quite good. Again, a bit more freelancing, developed my portfolio, got a really nice contract with PricewaterhouseCoopers, who had an in-house design studio. That all started to get a little bit intense. Workload was getting a bit crazy. So I decided that I'd take a month. I had this great CV by this point. And then I thought, have a little time off, and then I'll go back and I'll get something. I was living in Reading, so you had Silicon, the Silicon Corridor. And I'll get a job there. It'd be great. I'll be able to walk to work. It'd be fabulous. So while I was having my nice month off, the dot-com crash happened. And when I rang my agent and went, so, what have you got? It was like, haven't you heard? I'm like, heard what? Yeah, you're like, your job has gone away. And suddenly, overnight, I went from being hugely in demand, making great money, to not being able to find a job for 9 months. So that was interesting. I decided at that point, okay, it's very hard to get a job, but hey, the internet is still really interesting. I've got all these skills. So I took something that I was quite passionate about, learning the Welsh language, and decided to try and turn that into a business, teaching languages to people over the internet. That, I think, was a good idea at its core, but maybe I was a little ahead of the curve because it was quite difficult to get the reach that I needed to make the business sustainable. So when that didn't really work out, I took another thing I was quite passionate about, blogging, writing, and turned that into a business as well. And that actually did work. So that was fantastic. So over the last 10 years, I have mostly worked in social technologies with a bit of a sideline in activism. Co-founded the Open Rights Group in 2005 and founded Ada Lovelace Day in 2009. So that's my kind of career summary. I think you will agree that that is probably not a standard career path. But you know, when people talk about their careers, we often just get the edited highlights. People leave out the bits that either didn't go so well or that they don't feel are actually relevant anymore. So if you were really sharp-eyed on that previous slide, you might have seen a little offshoot where it said comedian. So this was something I tried actually while I was working in science publishing. And I had every intention that this was going to be like the thing, because this is the mid-90s, comedy is the new rock and roll, and this was really kind of something I wanted to try. And the truth is, I managed 4 gigs. Every time I had a gig booked, I would spend about a week kind of functioning subpar at work because I was really building up this amazing pant-wetting terror, this feeling of like, my head is going to explode. I'm so nervous about this gig. And I would go, and even if it was just like 5 minutes open mic, it would be like, okay, do this thing. Was getting laughs, was going quite well, up until the 4th gig. 250 people, which is a lot of people when you're a beginner. Big comedy venue in Hammersmith, and I died on my feet. I mean, it wasn't even that people weren't laughing. They weren't laughing and they weren't even paying attention. It was horrendous. And I never booked another gig. Now, generally speaking, when I'm talking about my career, I kind of leave that bit out. In fact, quite a lot of my actual career experience gets edited out or glossed over. So you have this glorious mess, which becomes a slightly smaller mess. And these are the things that I tend to mention to people. And I think when people read a biography of me, they might walk away thinking that I had some kind of grand plan, which I calmly and ruthlessly and efficiently executed. But the truth is that really, you know, my professional life has been somewhat haphazard, with its fair share of little cul-de-sacs and about turns. And I actually think that's the case for a lot more people than might care to admit it. I think when we read career summaries and we see interviews in the media and we see biographies and profiles and Q&As, what we get is a picture that's been very carefully edited, not just to include the best bits, but to include the expected bits. So what I do is I turn this into this, and it all makes a lot more sense. And it appears to show some evidence of a deliberate progression from science publishing, tech journalism, social media, advocate for women in STEM. It looks nice and smooth. What it actually is me thrashing my way through a bunch of unexpected events, trying to make the best out of opportunities, not always making it. Sometimes things go well, sometimes they don't. But this kind of sculpted career story is what interviewers want. It's what supervisors want. It's what strangers at parties want. But it's not the truth. It's kind of got a truthiness about it, but I know that it's a construction. When we discuss our professional selves, we are aware that other people have expectations around what we're going to tell them. They expect our careers to make sense. So we adjust our reality a little bit to make it look neat and tidy. But actually what we're often doing is post hoc rationalization. We're looking for a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story that we can tell, that others can understand without too much additional explanation. And, you know, we neglect to say that we took a job not because it was the best job for us, but because it was the only job we were offered. Or that we left a good job, not that I've ever done this, without anything to go to, not because that was a sensible step, but because our boss was driving us crazy and anything would be better. And that's fine so long as we remember what we're doing. I have to admit, I did not always understand that career paths are often not straight, that things tend not to go to plan. So I did have my life mapped out when I was a teen. I was going to spend a year in Australia, which I did. I was going to get a degree in geology. I was going to become a research assistant. I was going to be absolutely famous and everyone was going to know my name. I was going to be Jane Francis. That's who I was going to be. But like I say, the year I began my geology degree, the industry began a hiring freeze. Graduates had nowhere to go. There weren't any really attractive PhDs on offer. There was one in the middle of Spain. I decided I didn't really want to be in the middle of Spain, especially as actually being a blonde, I burned to a crisp in overcast weather. So it turned out that it was inevitable. My very carefully hatched plan would fail. And that dented my confidence a lot in my early 20s because my dream of being a geologist was gone. And for a long time, I thought that was my fault. I thought that was a failing in me. I didn't allow myself to understand that actually sometimes circumstances conspire against you. But maybe had I understood that career paths aren't necessarily straight, maybe I would have resolved to find another way. But I had this idea that everything had to work perfectly first time. And if they didn't, that it would never work at all. And that led me to making some decisions that perhaps weren't in my best interests at the time. Now, another kind of construct that we create is the origin story. And in comics, an origin story is the backstory of a character that explains how they got their superpowers, why they became a supervillain. And it's almost always revealed to the reader later on, once the character is well established. And I see origin stories in careers as well. That story of the moment in your life when you became inspired to study whatever it is that you're studying or follow a particular career path. And it's often described as an epiphany in childhood, where you realized what it was you were going to be when you grow up. But origin stories are like earthquakes. When an earthquake happens, it is impossible to say whether it is a foreshock or a main shock until afterwards, because an earthquake without another one in the same fault system is just an earthquake. It's only redefined as a foreshock once the main shock's happened. Origin stories don't become origin stories until we actually have the career. They're almost never realized as such at the time. And if that career doesn't pan out, the origin story is just forgotten. So I have a great origin story. Had I become the world famous geologist I was so keen on becoming, as a kid, I used to go up onto the heath by our house and collect flint nodules, all different colours, blue, green, pink, brown, fascinated by them. And I would bring them home and I'd put them with all the little rocks and stones that I'd picked up on holiday in Cornwall. And this collection of rocks was encouraged by this. This is the actual copy of Reader's Digest Atlas of the World that my parents have. And I was obsessed by these pages. I would read the text over and over again. I would look at the illustrations. I really wanted to have all of these rocks, really desperately. And this was what I decided that I wanted to do with my life. I would be surrounded by rocks, preferably ones that sparkled. It's still an ambition. This is one origin story for me. And there is another equally true origin story, which is that I knew I wanted to study science. And I wanted something that involved a little bit of chemistry, because I like chemistry. I also wanted a science that functioned on a human scale. So not something kind of microscopic or sort of universe size. I wanted something that I could mostly observe with the naked eye. And I also wanted a science where I thought there was still a lot to be discovered. It felt like all the simple things in physics had been done, nailed down. Gravity, sorted. Maths, not really my forte. Got a little bit confused with that whole imaginary number stuff. And biology, far too squishy. So I narrowed it down to geology. Did a one-year GCSE, the first year they came out, to sort of test drive the subject, see if I liked it, found it relatively easy, decided that was my degree, decided that was my career. Now, both of those stories are true. I think one, though, is decidedly more romantic than the other. And I think, had I become a geologist, had any journalist ever been interested in my story, I think we all know which one they would pick. I'm pretty sure it's not the one with the Venn diagram. Now, it's true that some people do have that amazing moment of insight where they kind of go, wow, this is amazing, this is what I want to do. And that is fabulous. If you have that flash of inspiration and you follow it through to discover that the thing you loved at 5 is the same thing you love at 15, is the same thing you love at 25, that's brilliant. But where I worry a little is when origin stories become used as a way to establish credibility and legitimacy through longevity. When people say, I am authentic, I am legitimate because I've been doing this since forever. And whilst I think in science there's a lot of sort of issues around longevity in the publication records and that actually do establish authority and credibility. In the arts, in the web sciences, you do see a lot of people trying to establish themselves purely through the fact that they've been doing something for a long time. So I think it's really important to understand that origin stories are not all they're cracked up to be, that not having one doesn't matter. It doesn't actually make any difference to whether you're going to be a success if you have this nice, romantic, pretty origin story or not, because it has no relationship to your ability, to your passions, or to your chance of success. So origin stories are just as truthy as our career summaries that we construct. But I think there's a deeper reason why it's important to understand the mess that is the truth of people's professional lives. And that is that we are creatures of story. We depend on stories to make sense of the world. The stories that we hear about other people and the stories that we tell about ourselves are how we understand the world around us and our place in it. So if we only ever hear the incredibly polished accounts of other people's careers, we start to develop, as I did as a teen and as a 20-something, unrealistic expectations of how we should experience our own professional lives. But that's a bit like reading To Kill a Mockingbird and forgetting that it started as a pretty dodgy first draft that needed 3 years of hard work to polish. It's forgetting all of the hard work that career scientists do to get from A to B, all of the nights in the lab and all of the really dull slog that you have to do to achieve anything. When we compare our lived experience to other people's edited highlights, of course our lives are going to look a little bit shabby in comparison. I think we have to learn not to make that comparison, not to criticize ourselves because we're not a startup billionaire at 25, not a Nobel laureate at 35, and not a famous TV personality at 45. Because the truth is, even for those people, it wasn't plain sailing. Not everyone hits their stride straight off the starting blocks, and I would actually say probably most people don't. So according to this graphic, Harrison Ford was a carpenter until his early 30s. Andrea Bocelli didn't break through until he was 33. And a woman called Mary Kate Ash, whom I've never heard of, but apparently she has a cosmetics empire. She founded that when she was 45. But frankly, these people are all still youngsters. Brian May famously took 37 years to finish his doctoral thesis, becoming a PhD on the 14th of May 2008 at the age of 60. But most impressive of all, last year in Australia, actress and politician Liz Kirkby got her PhD in history at the age of 93, with a thesis titled, "Will we ever learn from history the impact of economic orthodoxy on unemployment during the Great Depression in Australia?" Hats off to Dr. Kirkby. Because over time, these stories, the stories that we read about others, change the stories we tell to ourselves about what we are, what we've done, and what we're capable of. And these are the most important stories because they shape our actions in the present. Because you can only prepare for a future that you can imagine. So as they say, if you can't see it, you can't be it. If you don't know that a certain career choice exists, you can't make that choice. And I have two examples, one of which I'm going to insert rapidly into the lecture. If Professor Francis had lectured at my university about her career when I was still a student, I'm pretty sure I would have found a way to stay in geology because I found her story really exciting. Not just her personal story, but the work that she's doing, the research that she was doing. I don't recollect ever having that kind of a lecture when I was at uni. I don't recollect ever having discussions about how careers pan out, what our options are, how that might work. So not seeing how other people had navigated academia meant that I didn't have a mental model for how I might navigate academia, which meant that I wasn't very resilient. I had this setback, and that kind of blew it all up for me, and I just kind of forgot it and moved on. Now, the other example is the moment I realized there are people in this world who taste chocolate for a living. Why did my careers advisor at school never mention this to me? I've already mentioned I quite like chemistry. I quite like chocolate as well. In fact, my blog is called Chocolate and Vodka. And I wonder what my life would be now if I had realized that there were people who taste chocolate for a living, who understand how chocolate is made, who understand the chemistry of chocolate. And it might be tempting to put this down as a failure of imagination, but actually I think it's more down to the lack of role models that I saw when I was growing up, and particularly women role models. There just weren't that many role models in science when I was a child, when I was a teen, when I was a young woman. So it was that sense of looking for things to do and looking to see myself in others and others' achievements was very hard to find myself. And that is one of the reasons why I run Ada Lovelace Day. It's about creating new role models for women in science and technology. And it's prompted by some research that I stumbled on in 2009 from a psychologist called Penelope Lockwood. And she found that women need female role models more than men need male role models. And she said, outstanding women can function as inspirational examples of success, illustrating the kinds of achievements that are possible for the women around them. They demonstrate that it is possible to overcome traditional gender barriers, indicating to other women that high levels of success are indeed attainable. So it is our aim to create new role models, to share some fascinating stories, and to teach people, to teach women that actually it is possible to overcome major challenges in order to be successful. And for me personally, having been doing this for the last 7 years, seeing and understanding so many different varied stories of women in STEM has driven home just how variable careers are and that there isn't a standard career path. In fact, the ideal that we have of the standard career, I think, is quite rare in reality, because life is just never that straightforward. And I want to give you 3 examples of women that I've personally really been inspired by. The first, and one of my favorites, is Chien-Shiung Wu, a Chinese nuclear physicist working in America during the Second World War, who for 8 years was completely cut off from her family back in China. She solved Enrico Fermi's plutonium chain reaction problem, realizing that a buildup of xenon, which is a plutonium fission byproduct, was capturing the neutrons required to sustain the reaction. Through her work on beta decay, she came to work with 2 other theoretical physicists, Tsung-Dao Li and Chen-Ning Yang, on the question of whether the law of conservation of parity always held true. Now, this law was as well established as gravity at that point. Even if you've never heard of it now, then it was a pretty major deal. But there were doubts about it. And Wu designed an experiment to test the law and found that parity was not always conserved, proving that the tau meson and the theta meson were the same particle. Li and Yang got a Nobel Prize for that. Wu did not. Then there's Wilhelmina Fleming, a Scottish woman who moved to Boston with her husband. After 2 years of marriage, he left her at the age of 23 with their child, and she had no money, nowhere to live, and she ended up becoming a maid to a man called Edward Pickering, who was a professor at the Harvard College Observatory. Fleming had been a teacher back in Scotland, and eventually Pickering promoted her to work on the identification of stars captured on photographic plates. By the end of her career, she'd catalogued over 10,000 stars, discovered 310 variable stars, 10 novae, 52 nebulae, and discovered the hot, dense stars that we now call white dwarfs. She also discovered the Horsehead Nebula and helped develop a system for cataloguing stars, one that we still use today in a slightly tweaked version. And then there's Ada Lovelace herself, daughter of Lord Byron and a woman called Annabella Milbank. She wrote the first computer program. In 1843, she published a translation of some work by a mathematician called Luigi Menabrea, and he had described a machine called the analytical engine, which was invented by a guy called Charles Babbage, with whom Ada was friends. Ada translated this from French into English. It was suggested that she expand the paper with her own notes, seeing as she knew the machine so well. And in that paper, she does two things. She writes the first computer program to calculate Bernoulli numbers, and this was the first time that a machine could be programmed to calculate an outcome that had not been worked out by humans first. And she foresaw that this machine, which was never built, which she never got to actually tinker with, that this analytical engine could do very human things like create art and music. And she really foresaw computer science as we know it now, 100 years before Alan Turing, and in a society where computing was done by humans with pen and paper, and the idea of a machine being able to calculate something that had not been entered into it first was a massive sea change. And I find these stories actually very inspiring. And the sense of that if she can do it, I can do it, to me, even now, is really important. And one concrete example of this, in December 2013, my husband was offered a job in Sheboygan in Wisconsin. His start date was 9th of February 2014, but the wrinkle in the plan was I didn't have a visa. So he moved over to America, I stayed here, packed up the flat, sorted out all the paperwork. We were apart for 5 months, which, looking back on it, was really hard at the time. But actually, knowing that Chien Chiung Wu had been apart from her family for 8 years with no contact, and here was I able to Skype and text and use instant messenger and Twitter and everything else, made me realize actually it's not that bad. You know, it's not a fun process moving continents, but actually it's not that bad. So it made it much more tolerable knowing that there was someone that I knew about, however much, in the past her experience was, that was so analogous to mine, where I could say, right, okay, if she can do it, I can do it. And the more we surround ourselves with these stories, and the more varied and unusual they are, the more we draw strength from the women through history, and the more able we are to imagine unusual and interesting futures for ourselves. Because these days we need to depart from the stereotypical concept of the career. The economy has changed radically over the last 50 years, and jobs for life are astonishingly rare. There are still standard career paths available in academia, if you're lucky, but there's no guarantee that you will find a clear career path within even a single discipline. So we're increasingly seeing people develop what's called a portfolio career, where you're actually running 2 or more part-time jobs or freelance projects at the same time, projects which may require different but not necessarily unrelated skills. And I think that's really what I've had, is a portfolio career. But if we look at it a bit more closely, we can spot 4 key areas of expertise: science, journalism, technology, and activism. And all of my jobs have really focused on 3 related skill sets: the analytical skills, editorial, and technological skills. And the 2 jobs that I'm focused on today and that I got most pleasure and satisfaction out of combine all 3 areas. This kind of career is not unusual amongst my peers. I particularly see people in technology and in journalism switching between holding a full-time job and then having to become a freelance consultant for a while before maybe going back to full-time employment. And sometimes a period of freelancing is inevitable, whether because of redundancies, which are incredibly common in journalism at the moment, or because maybe the tech startup that you were working for ran out of money or got bought. But I don't think that these sorts of careers are limited to tech and journalism. And I do believe it's really worth developing your skill set that lends themselves to other fields of endeavour, even if you're not in tech or journalism. Because even if you are determined to stay the course in your chosen subject, you may find yourself at times stuck between jobs, needing to earn a little bit more money while you study. And these days, there's a lot of online matchmaking services where you can find clients and develop this portfolio. But it's not just economically useful. I actually think that it's really important to expand your horizons and give yourself experiences that you wouldn't otherwise get, because a portfolio career gives you immense flexibility and it enables choices that maybe wouldn't otherwise land on your lap. So for example, the one time my geology degree has crossed over with my professional career was after the Eyjafjallajökull eruption in 2010. I had watched this eruption literally, because there were webcams everywhere, with great interest, to the point where my husband complained that he was a bit of a volcano widower. I had a wiki. I was collecting all the links to all the coverage, the sort of the science of it and the coverage in the mainstream media. And when Chatham House decided that they wanted to do a report into the effects of the ash cloud disruption on business and civil society, they found my wiki, they found me, we had a couple of conversations, and I ended up doing an analysis of the media coverage of the disruption. And that forms one of the chapters in this larger report. It also helped, the portfolio career really sort of helped in 2011. My husband and I were working together with the largest media network in India called Network 18 to create and launch a new news website. So this again was, a lot of analysis in terms of understanding the Indian audience, very different to the kind of audiences I was used to working with in the UK and the US. Obviously, social media skills become incredibly important when you're designing a site that is at its core supposed to be social. And the editorial skills, because writing a comprehensive strategy document covering not just social media, but also the editorial strategy, the production strategy, and the technical development strategy quite helps to have those skills to put all that together. And these are projects that I would not have been able to do had I not had such a varied career. And in my experience, interesting things happen on the boundaries. For me, being an analytical person has been useful, but actually having the editorial skills and the technical skills have also been essential. And I would not have been able to do much of the projects that I have done if I didn't have those extra skills. It's at the boundaries where you can not just make up your own career path, you can actually make up your own job out of whole cloth. So we'll go back in time to 2004. I'm in a bit of a pickle. My language learning startup crashed and burned. I had to go back and live with my parents in Dorset. I'd enjoyed working as a journalist, so I decided that maybe that was something I should try again. But I now had tech skills, I had a good tech network, so I decided to become a tech journalist, did an online course, how to pitch article ideas to editors, and got cracking. And I was blogging a lot at this point. I'd started blogging in 2001, so I'm 3 years in. Blogging's massive at this stage. Lots of people in the UK doing it, lots of people in America, lots of great contacts, real community feel to it. And a company gets in touch and says, we've got a blog, we'd like you to write for us. Great, perfect. They send me the URL to this blog, and I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, this isn't good. This is not good. There was a problem. They were a snack food company. None of these, just to be clear. And they wanted to market their snack food to school kids. School kids were notoriously not reading blogs at the time. This is really kind of before the era where everybody has the kids have mobile phones, but even now I think they're not reading blogs. So they had some technical issues as well. The way that the software was set up was not correct. So I offered to discuss all of this with them, went up to HQ, sat down with them for a day, went through everything that they were doing wrong, and talked them out of the whole project, thus talking them out of the very job they were trying to offer me. They were honourable, and they paid me for my time, which made me kind of go, oh, hang on a minute. I like know stuff that other people don't know. This whole blogging thing is still quite new, and there's obviously people who need my help. So I created a job that really hadn't existed before, and set about getting clients. So for the last 11 years, I've worked with household brands on different uses of social media, from community building to collaboration. And although I wasn't the only one working in blogs at that time, there were no more than a dozen of us worldwide doing what I was doing. So there was no one to say, hey, I think it would be a really good idea if you did some consulting around this whole new blogs thing. In fact, most of the people that I knew were web developers and software developers, and they were all kind of like, don't be stupid, you know, like blogging's really easy. No one is going to need to be taught how to do this. But it turns out that not everyone is quite as tech savvy as the people who build the internet. That then led me more deeply into technology, and particularly into tech activism. And I became interested in EU legislation around data retention. And I was hanging around with a group of digital activists, as you do. We all felt we ought to be doing more. So at a conference, an event called Open Tech in 2005, a group of us basically said, yeah, we are going to do something to combat this data retention directive, and the Open Rights Group was eventually born. By the end of my tenure as the first executive director and co-founder of the Open Rights Group, we had created a non-profit, company limited by guarantee. We'd campaigned alongside the European activists against data retention in the EU. We'd drawn up a detailed submission for the GAWA's review of intellectual property, which actually saw us go into give evidence before a parliamentary committee. And I managed to establish org as the go-to voice on these issues for the news organisations. It was an amazing and educational experience, which taught me not just how to actually be an activist, but also how to think on my feet and how to use, again, social media and editorial skills to create this organisation, which basically was 2 part-time people, and make it look like we had a whole office of staff. Making up jobs like that is now, I think, a key skill. The pace of change is such that it's impossible to predict what technology is going to do next and how that is going to affect the jobs market. So robots have transformed the manufacturing industries, making a lot of jobs obsolete. At the same time, the miniaturization of computers and sensors has created a whole new industry, the remote sensing industry, which couldn't have existed before. So in order to invent your own job, you need to be willing to kind of take that leap into the future. You need to find the cutting edge in your area and kind of live there, inhabit the cutting edge. You need to explore the boundaries between different disciplines. Basically, you have to be willing to cross the streams. So that's all well and good for me to say. I've been doing this for a while, and I think I've got the knack of it now. How do you get started? If you want this kind of portfolio career, if you're interested in sort of doing things people haven't done before, I think the way to do this is really think about what is the art of the possible. You don't have to be a coder or a software developer to understand technology and how to use technology. Technology is transformative, and it is transforming work in all different areas. So how can you use cutting-edge technology to change what you do? We learn a lot from other people, so always be on the lookout for new role models. What have other people done? How did they do it? Look beneath the shiny surface and ask, what challenges did they have? What were the rocky parts of their career, and how did they get over that? How did they get around problems or solve problems? But always remember that when we hear other people's career stories, we are getting a little truthiness. So be skeptical and look for what's not said. Experiment with ideas. It's taken me some considerable time and a couple of fairly big errors of judgment to get where I am. And I don't regret making those mistakes. I don't regret the startup that didn't work out, because ultimately there's no point sitting on your idea and hoping that it will one day hatch out fully formed into this perfect thing, because it won't. You learn every time you mess up, and it prepares you to do better next time. So never let failure scare you. Have a good, healthy respect for failure, but although failure can exact an emotional toll, it always teaches us the lessons that we need to learn. Tim Harford has a great book called Adapt, and the subheading is Why All Success Begins with Failure, and it's absolutely true. So I'd like to wish you all well in your future careers, and I really hope that you enjoy a career that is maybe a little bit more noun than verb. Thank you.